Okay, so today we're going deep on something pretty controversial, and it's this idea of transracialism.
Yeah.
So, like, can someone actually identify as different race than the one they were, like, born into?
Yeah. I mean, it's a question that keeps popping up, and your sources really run the gamut from like YouTube debates and Reddit forums, like, black to white transracials and diaracials,
Right.
to serious academic papers and even a pilot study on transracial identity. So it's clearly something people are grappling with. And of course, it always seems to get tangled up with the whole conversation about transgenderism. Like, are they similar? Are they totally different?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a big part of what makes this whole topic so tricky and potentially even harmful.
Yeah.
So as we kind of wade into all these different viewpoints, we really want to think about the ethical side of things, especially for marginalized communities, and how this all plays into the fight for racial equality.
Absolutely. It's not just an abstract philosophical debate. This has real world consequences, and we have to be mindful of that.
Okay, so first things first, like when we even say race and ethnicity, what are we really talking about?
Right, good point, because even those terms can be loaded. So you found this Wikipedia entry on ethnicity, which is actually a great place to start because it talks about how our thinking has shifted.
Yeah, it mentioned that like old school view, the primordialist view, which is all about, ethnic groups having these ancient, unchanging roots.
Right, like it's all in your blood and it goes back centuries.
But then there's the newer view, the
Yeah.
constructivist view, where ethnicity is much more about what society says, is like these rules we create about who belongs where.
Exactly. And it's super interesting when you put that next to the stuff on race, like that Wikipedia entry and the YouTube discussion about the biology versus social construction of race, you see the same kind of evolution happening.
Yeah, totally. So, like, in the past, people were really hung up on those biological traits, like skin color, hair, texture, all that stuff.
And the In Defense of Transracialism video even uses those terms like phenotype and genotype. It's all about those outward appearances and genetics.
Right, but the scientific consensus now is pretty much like, nah, race isn't really about biology, it's a social construct.
Right, the biological differences between these big racial categories are way less significant than we used to think.
And that Wikipedia entry makes another really important point, which is like, okay, even if race isn't this like hard biological fact, it still lines up really closely with things like social class and, people's life chances.
Yeah, so as a social construct, it has huge real world implications. It shapes people's experiences and opportunities in really profound ways.
So even though it might not be real in a purely biological sense, it's definitely real in terms of how it impacts people's lives.
Absolutely. And we see this in the In Defense of Transracialism video too. They actually give like a whole list of possible ways to define race, like phenotype, genotype, ancestry, genetic markers, even like behavior and cultural stuff.
Wow. So it's not exactly straightforward.
No, it's super messy, and that just underscores how much of a construct it is. It's not this neat and tidy box, it's more like this constantly shifting category.
So all of that brings us to this really central question. And it's the one that always seems to come up, the comparison between transracial and transgender identities.
Yeah, and that's the heart of that if Jenner then Dolezal argument that came up in the philosophical paper and that academic comparison you found.
So the thinking goes, like, if we're cool with transgender people saying, hey, this is my gender identity, even if it doesn't match what, society assigned me at birth.
Then why shouldn't we apply that same logic to race? Like the In Defense of Transracialism video suggests, why can't someone say, this is my racial identity, even if it doesn't match my biology?
Yeah, that's the core argument. But then you start getting into all these tricky ethical considerations.
Right, because while both trans people and transracial people might feel this disconnect between how they're seen and who they feel they are, the sources also point out some key differences, like that YouTube video asking, is it possible to change one's race?
Oh, yeah, that one was interesting.
It makes a big point about racial oppression being something that's passed down through generations. Unlike gender identity, it's not just about individual feelings, it's about this whole history of systemic disadvantage, and that adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Yeah, that historical baggage is really heavy. And then there's that other video, let's all get past this confusion about trans people, which argues that gender actually does have a biological component. It's not just social.
Right, so that kind of muddies the waters even more because while the biological basis for race is weak, the role of biology and gender is still very much up for debate.
So it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison. And then that philosophical paper brought up another ethical dilemma, which is that a white person who identifies as a different race could theoretically always go back to their white identity and benefit from white privilege.
Yeah, but the paper also acknowledges that that might not be so different from a trans woman who might benefit from past male privilege. So it's not necessarily a clear-cut argument against transracialism.
It's more about acknowledging that privilege is always part of the equation. And that brings us right to the potential harm for marginalized communities.
You're right, because like that philosophical paper points out, when a white person identifies as a different race, especially a race that's faced historical oppression, it can feel like they're exercising white privilege.
Especially if it seems like they think it's easy or something.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's the whole issue of cultural appropriation, which the RCTA Understanding RCTA document explains really well. Like when someone adopts the clothes or hairstyles or even the language of another culture without truly understanding or respecting its meaning, it can be incredibly disrespectful and even harmful.
It's like they're reducing someone's culture to a costume.
Yeah, and it trivializes the struggles and the lived experiences of that group. And the RCTA document also points out that focusing on changing your appearance to look like a different race can actually reinforce things like colorism and systemic racism.
Because it plays into that whole idea that lighter skin is better and, you should aspire to look a certain way.
Right, and it makes you wonder, like, are some people trying to identify as a different race because they've internalized those harmful societal messages?
That's a really uncomfortable question.
Yeah.
But it's one we have to ask. And, on the flip side, there are people who identify as transracial who argue that opposing transracialism actually restricts their freedom of expression.
Yeah, like the diracial community of Reddit. They're worried that it limits how people of color can express themselves and puts these artificial boundaries on identity.
So it's like this clash between, wanting to protect marginalized groups from harm and wanting to respect individual autonomy. And that In Defense of Transracialism video really hits on how loaded this whole issue is because race has been used as this tool of oppression for so long.
And that same video makes a really strong point about Rachel Dolezal, who's, a white woman who identified as black. They argue that she can never truly understand what it means to be black in America, to experience that daily reality of racism.
It's a perspective that really resonates. And that academic paper comparing transgender and transracial identities makes another really important distinction. It says that unlike with sex and gender race, and how race is embodied, are often seen as the same thing.
So, like, you can change how you express your gender and even medically transition to align your body with your gender identity.
But changing your race in a way that erases all that social and historical context is way more complicated.
Yeah, it's not a simple swap. And that leads us to the whole question of how transracialism impacts the fight for racial equality.
Right, because that Wikipedia entry on ethnicity makes it clear that race is still a major factor in inequality.
And the argument is that we should be focusing on dismantling systemic racism, not on, individual choices about racial identity.
And blaming culture for inequality is dangerous too because it ignores the bigger systemic issues.
Totally. It's like saying, oh, if only those people would just act differently, but it completely misses the point.
And that YouTube video about changing race uses the example of residential schools in Canada to show how the impact of racial inequality can last for generations.
It's a trauma that echoes through time and that doesn't really have a parallel in discussions of gender.
But the In Defense of Transracialism video has this really radical idea, which is that maybe we should just abolish the whole concept of fixed racial categories.
They think that if we didn't have these rigid categories, then race wouldn't be such a source of division and conflict.
That's a pretty big if, though.
Yeah, because the reality is that race is still used to categorize and profile people all the time, like in law enforcement, which the Wikipedia entry on race points out.
So even if we wish it wasn't real, those systems are still in place. And then there's all that historical baggage, like the YouTube video on the history of racism in science. It shows how race has been used to justify some truly awful things.
It's a history that we can't just ignore. And that video, the YouTuber who doesn't get racism, makes a really good point, which is that trying to change how individuals behave without addressing the systemic issues doesn't really work.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg.
Exactly. It's not going to fix the problem.
So we've talked a lot about these big ideas, but I think it's also important to hear from people who actually identify as transracial.
And you found some really powerful accounts in those Reddit communities like Black to White Transracials, the Diracial Community, and Ask Transrace, and of course that pilot study on transracial identity.
It's like a glimpse into their lived experiences. And what's striking is how many of them talk about feeling this deep connection to a culture or a race that's different from their own.
And they take all kinds of steps to align their appearance with that identity, like changing their hair, using makeup, tanning, even considering surgery, as Martina Big did.
And there's that really sad story from the Black to white transracials community about someone who internalized racism so much that a family member tried to take their own life because they hated being Black, and the family's reaction was to just ban any talk about race.
It shows how deeply personal and painful these issues can be, and then the In Defense of Transracialism video brings up the experiences of Asian Americans who often feel like they're caught between different racial categories.
And I talk about the added complexity of white people identifying as Asian, which can be really frustrating and invalidating for actual Asian people.
Yeah, it's like their identity is being appropriated, and the RCTA document raises some important ethical questions about all of this. Like, are we just reinforcing harmful beauty standards? And, are people doing this for the right reasons?
It's not always clear-cut, and we can't forget about Oli London, who's kind of become this poster child for transracialism.
The In Defense of Transracialism video actually addresses that and talks about how some people think he's more interested in attention than genuine identity.
And then there's Martina Big from that podcast episode. She's actually gone through some pretty extreme physical modifications to appear Black.
And she gets all kinds of reactions. Some people are curious, others are completely skeptical.
It shows how divided people are on this whole issue. So to wrap things up, it's clear that transracialism is super complex, and it's no wonder it provokes such strong reactions because it touches on these really fundamental questions about race, identity, and social justice.
Absolutely. And ethical implications are huge, especially when it comes to potentially harming marginalized groups and, how this all affects the fight for racial equality.
We've heard from people who see race as fluid and changeable, and from others who see it as this deep-rooted social and historical reality.
And there's no easy answer to the question of where individual freedom ends and the well-being of the community begins.
So I think we're left with this really big question for everyone listening, given what we know about race and identity. Where do we draw the ethical lines, and how do we move forward in a way that doesn't perpetuate harm or undermine the fight for equality?
It's a conversation that's not going away anytime soon, and it's one that we all need to engage with thoughtfully and with compassion.
So keep thinking, keep learning, and keep talking about this because it's something that affects all of us.
Exactly. These are conversations that need to be had, and it's by engaging with these complex issues that we can hopefully move towards a more just and equitable world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive,
It's been a pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
See you then.